Hello everyone and welcome to another one of our Live at Truthdig. I'm Sarah Wesley, your host, Communications Coordinator here at Truthdig. We're also joined by a very special guest in this timely climate of the political election 2016. Greg Palast has joined us today. He's an investigative journalist. He's worked with the BBC, The Guardian, and has a new book out actually called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. It's accompanied by a nice little film also, and he's done a bunch of research on elections, and especially this election, and in 2000 with that crazy election. And so he has a lot of research, maybe alluding to widespread election rigging, so we're going to get into all of that. We're also joined by Kasha Anderson, our deputy editor, and Emma Niles, staff writer, will be tuning in to all of your Facebook comments and questions and suggestions. Take a moment to leave anything that comes to your mind right below the video if you find it interesting. So let's get started. Greg Palast, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you. And for all of our readers, let's just give them a brief overview of your research and why it's relevant to this election.
Okay, I created a film for Rolling Stone magazine said that I have the evidence that Donald Trump is going to steal this election and his cronies are going to steal the United States Senate, and it looked like I was going to be the biggest fool out because I spent the fortune on a film. We have results when I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be a fool. Unfortunately, I wasn't a fool. America's been made a fool of. This election was, as Donald Trump says, this election is rigged. This election was rigged, and it was his cronies who rigged it. And my investigation for Rolling Stone laid out in detail and quantified how they went through and basically ripped off these Republican-controlled swing states. There are 5 swing states, and Hillary won only one officially because it's the only one in which you had a Democratic Secretary of State running the elections. Everything else was violently, viciously, and I uncovered several, beginning with something called interstate crosscheck, and that's the #1 way that they shoplifted this election.
And can you explain to our readers what that means, interstate crosscheck, for someone who's not familiar with the process at all?
Okay, interstate crosscheck, this election's rigged, which you really have to pay attention to very, very. It's rigged because people. Now, Sarah, if you've for 5 years, it's a federal felony crime. Now, if the home over about people voting multiple times, I wouldn't care. It wouldn't matter. 2 years, and what we uncovered was that his name, especially a guy named Chris Kobach, who's on the transition team, the guy will probably be in charge of the Homeland Security and Immigration. Chris got the other Republican secretaries of state, these are little Catherine Harris's, the little weasels that run our voting systems, highly partisan job, and that their entire voting rolls to hunt for people who are voting more than once. Now, no one is in favor of someone breaking the law and voting more than once.
Right.
So what they did is they said, okay, if John Brown voted in this is a real case, John Brown votes in Georgia and John Brown votes in Virginia, that they wipe out registration. Now it's weird because
in both states, right?
In both states. Now here's the weird thing. 2 things. Number one, if you why aren't they arresting these people? Because they didn't commit the crime. They had guys named James Brown. James, and they had guys in other states named James Brown. Obviously the same voter, even though in Georgia it's James Brown Jr., and Virginia it's James Brown Sr., and it's James Edward Brown Jr., and James Thomas Brown Sr., and yet they say these are the same voters. Now here's the trick. So they were literally, and how big is this suspect list of people voting twice? 7.2 million names of double voters. Now, no one questioned this system because no one got the lists. And as you said, I'm an investigative reporter. That's why I see the hat. I'm an investigative reporter. And so as an investigative reporter, I spent with a whole team, 5 months, we got our hands on those lists.
So can you just situate us in time when you got your hands on those
I first got the list about 2 years ago. It took 5 months of work.
Yeah.
And because remember, Donald Trump, by the way, has been talking about this rigged election and multiple voters since before he announced. He was on the speaking circuit for a group called Citizens United. People don't know this story. This is where he started, okay? And that's one of their claims, that people are voting many times. So they created a list, an official list of 7 million suspects. No one could get the list because it's, criminals, you can't get a criminal suspect list. I got the list, and I looked through it, and you look at these names. For example, in my film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, I go and meet some of these terrible double voters. I go in Ohio and meet Donald Alexander Webster Jr., Donald Webster. They said he's the same voter as the Donald Webster in Virginia, except Donald Webster in Virginia is Donald Eugene Webster Sr. There's just no connection. It's just a common name.
You mentioned earlier that this rigging is racially charged.
Yeah.
On that?
You got it. See, race is the Achilles heel of American electoral system. We're still running Jim Crow elections, except now white sheets to scare away black voters. They're using spreadsheets. So one of the tricks here is that it's basically common names: James Brown, John Black, and by the way, David Lee. The Asian American community was really hit hard by this cross-check because, for example, in the Korean community, it's 4 names: Park, Ho, Lee, and Kim. That's it. And so they got really wiped out in the Korean community.
And also Hispanic voters, right?
Well, let's put it this way. 96% of people named Garcia are Hispanic. Now, I don't know who the other 4% are, but all I know is that the sense is 96% of Garcias are Hispanic.
Right.
As our experts, we brought in experts from eBay and the people that handle eBay's and Amazon and American Express databases, and they never get it wrong. You never, you never get a toaster meant for one James Brown that's supposed to go to another.
Funny how that works.
So
yeah.
they don't mess it up. They don't send the wrong bill out to the wrong people, right? So how did this happen? They deliberately use a deliberately poor system, and what happens is in America, the history of blacks meant that African Americans have common names, tend to share names, like James Brown. The history of the conquest in Latin America means that there are 836,000 people named Garcia. If your name is Joe Garcia or Jose Garcia, as our experts say, you're supposedly voted in 27 states. No, you're just Garcia. So, but if your name is Charles Koch, for example, that's a unique name. There is no other Charles Koch. There's one. If your name is Chris
You would know, right?
Chris Koch who runs the system, there's one. So white people tend to have these very unique names. The Census Bureau keeps track of the racial breakdown of every single surname in America. So we got the census documents, compared it to the list, and lo and behold, this was a complete Jim Crow purge operation.
So what I'm understanding is that they're targeting the African American, Latino, and Asian community because they're most likely to vote Democrat.
Exactly,
and that's why it's the GOP.
Exactly. And see, it used to be, this is the first attack on Asian Americans, because previously Asian Americans, a couple decades ago, voted Republican, and now they're voting as if they've turned black. In fact, in my film, I have a segment called Voting Gangnam Style. I have a bunch of Korean kids who are dancing Gangnam Style to try to get their parents to vote. So they call it Voting Gangnam Style, and then they go pop, pop, pop. They turn black, and suddenly they're all there. There's John Lewis dancing Gangnam Style. So this is the only film in which you will ever see John Lewis dance Gangnam Style, the great civil rights leader and congressman. And what's happening is that so they went after the Asian American vote because it's going solid Democrat, even more than Hispanics. So what's happened is, this is a cheap way to get rid of these voters, and no one is going to defend people voting twice. It was done stealth, so no one knew about it. I tried to raise the alarm, so I made a movie. I tried to do everything, meeting these people. In fact, actually, there are a few white people on there, including one Willie Nelson, country singer, I've heard, and who's accused of voting a second time as Willie Mae Nelson. So they didn't even match the genitals, let alone the middle names. In fact, I go in to see Willie. I bang on because it looks like he could vote in multiple states. He lives on a bus. He's got all these state
And he
stickers
has
on.
some residents in Hawaii too, right?
Right. So what happened is I go into Willie's bus and I confront him with the evidence. He voted twice and he kept giggling because he just thought it was pretty ridiculous. So finally I said, "Are you high on something? Are you smoking something?" He said, "Aren't you?" Because this is this. And so while a lot of the film is done as fun and slapstick, it's really pretty grim stuff because it's a deeply racist program.
A lot of our readers definitely are agreeing with the sentiment of a rigged election, but they're really focused on the DNC primaries and thinking that Hillary stole the election from Bernie Sanders. Did you do work on that as well?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I got roundly attacked by the Washington Post, which said respected investigative reporter Greg Palast, and I'm going to quote the respected part. Respected investigative reporter Greg Palast has lent his name to conspiracy theories that Bernie Sanders won the Democratic primary. I called up the writer and I said, since when is arithmetic a conspiracy theory? In fact, one of the things that really killed Sanders in the Democratic primary in California was that over 1 million people were shunted to something called provisional ballots. Now, I call them placebo ballots because they rarely get counted. This is, by the way, how we know Hillary won. Exit polls in the swing states went for Hillary. The problem is that people, when they exit the polls, say, here's how I voted. But they don't know if their vote counted. So for example, if you're on the Crosscheck list and your name is missing, they don't say you can't vote. They say, no, filled out this ballot. They usually say, we'll count it later, which is not true. The little old lady,
the provisional ballot.
Right, the provisional ballot, you fill out this thing, you stick it in an envelope for her. You walk outside to the exit poll, so you say, how did you vote? I voted for Hillary. Yeah, but your vote didn't count. So now the United States State Department uses exit polls as the legal standard for measuring whether an election's been rigged. In Ukraine, in Serbia, in Peru, the United States State Department wait a minute, what about this week, this past week, where Trump lost in the exit polls? Now, polling is often off if you're projecting because you don't know who's actually going to vote.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was a big problem in this election.
But the reason why exit polls are considered the absolute standard and trustworthy is that someone just voted. They can tell you, they didn't walk in and not vote, or they'll say so, but you know who they voted for, they just did it.
Right.
So if there's a difference between exit polls and the official count, something went wrong. And so we have something like 5 million, you ready for this? This is never discussed. There's something like 5 million provisional ballots that were cast in this presidential election. There were in addition 2 or 3 million votes that were invalidated for other reasons. They call it spoiled. Now in my movie I have like this Uncle Wiggily game, like all the 10 ways you can spoil it. I use cartoons. I hired the guy that drew Who Framed Roger Rabbit to draw cartoons. So I have a lot of cartoons. And so
Keeps people's attention,
it keeps
right?
people's attention
Right.
and tells you something grim about our democracy, but in a funny way.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is, but there's many ways your vote's spoiled because the machines don't, for example, machines don't record or something. But we saw for the first time white people get provisional ballots. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was in Palm Springs, about as white as it could get, and I was in an audience of 100 or so people, and I said, how many of you have ever received a provisional ballot? There were 2 black men in the audience, that's it. Those are the only 2 people that raised their hand. The 2 black men in the audience raised their hand, got a provisional ballot. This past June in California, 1 million white folk got provisional ballots. They didn't even know what the hell these things were because they're black ballots. They're handed out like candy in minority areas for any little thing, your name's not there, whatever. So we really have these Jim Crow apartheid elections. It's enough. The numbers are enough. For example, in Michigan, I came a little late to the broadcast. I do apologize because I was talking to the Michigan ACLU, which wants to take action because Trump supposedly won by 13,107 votes. It's minuscule. But the number of people on the Crosscheck purge list
were 449,000, almost 500,000. Now, not all of them got removed, but basically, Trump would not have Michigan if it weren't for this cross-check purge. And you look at Florida, if it weren't for the games that they played there, no way, etc. I was in Ohio on election day and the weekend before. Massive, massive suppression of the black vote. North Carolina, same thing. So if you go to North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those states were flipped by Jim Crow tactics, and therefore Donald Trump wasn't elected. He was selected by a Jim Crow process.
You've also mentioned to me a couple of times we've spoken about this, and we also have a new interview with you posted on the website. And you were talking
From
about
before the election.
Before the election, too. Yeah, one before, one after, before and after pictures here. But you talked about how there were also the Voting Rights Act, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court had a big impact, since this is the first presidential election that we've had since that happened in 2013.
So
that's another piece of your puzzle,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you just heard about this stuff where you wipe out guys named James Brown.
Yeah.
Because James Brown Jr. votes in Georgia and James Brown Sr. votes in New Mexico. So you say, like, no, they're not the same James Brown. You couldn't get this type of system approved by the federal government under the old Voting Rights Act. So this was the first Jim Crow election. It was the first we had Jim Crow official in this nation until the Voting Rights Act of '65. 3 years ago, the Supreme Court sliced up the Voting Rights Act, and it's only because of that Donald Trump was elected. Let me tell you, Barack Obama would not be president if the Voting Rights Act had been gutted in 2007. Donald Trump is the direct Rosemary's baby of the destruction of the Voting Rights Act, and look out, because he's got both houses of Congress, he'll have control of the Supreme Court, and they're going to try and eliminate the rest of the Voting Rights Act.
We have a reader question that just came in. Richard J. Hoban, who's
Richard.
watching, wants to know pretty blankly, how do we stop this? How do we change it? Do you have any thoughts on that moving forward?
It's not easy, but getting your voting rights has never been easy. Ask Martin Luther King, who took a bullet for it. And I'm working a lot with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's my co-author at Rolling Stone. And let me tell you, it's a process. We're going to have to restore a voting rights movement in this nation. And what that means is, as we did in '65, look, in 1965, Martin Luther King, the black folk didn't have the votes. They didn't have that power. They didn't have the guns. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the banks. They didn't have the politicians. And yet they won because, as Senator Sanders, Hank Sanders of Selma, Alabama, said, we had marching feet, we had praying prayers, we had singing songs. They massed 35,000 people in Selma, marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. 4 people were murdered on that march. Okay, it wasn't a walk in the park.
Yeah.
4 people murdered. You meet the people who were beaten nearly to death. One young woman, Linda Blackman, who's in my film.
Yeah.
She was beaten so severely that she was actually loaded into a hearse. They thought she was dead. Then she jumped up. She came to, jumped up, and she ran right back to the bridge to continue marching. That's what you got to do. You think you're dead, you're not. You got to get up and keep marching.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If we do get up in March, what are we demanding from Congress? What type of policies? Because it's clear that obviously in the Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton primaries, that was rigged. That came out in WikiLeaks. So it's not just happening on the GOP side, but it's also happening on the Democratic side.
That's
so
right. What
are the policies that we need to demand when we're out there protesting?
There's several things. Number one, we have to protect the remnants of the Voting Rights Act and then reverse it so that we get back the right to vote, that no one can lose their vote because of the color of their skin and through any trickery that results in people losing their vote because of the color of their skin or their age, because they went after students, they went after, basically the poor. They go after those who are vulnerable and therefore democratic in the general. You can't count on the Democratic Party to be your defender because in primaries, the Democratic Party gets its hands dirty with these same tricks.
Yeah.
And then they turn around and say, okay, we stole your vote in June, but forget about that vote for us now in November. So they lose all their legitimacy. The Democratic Party is not the vehicle for saving your vote. But we have to do it ourselves. So we have leaders, we have organization from the National Action Movement. We have, I just off the phone with the ACLU, and we have the great, I'm going to be, by the way, I'll be in Washington, D.C. on the 13th of December. There'll be a special congressional hearing to review my evidence, which will be hosted also by Barbara Arnwine, who is the great voting rights attorney. So you got to work with progressive organizations. We have to join together, and we have to, if we can't win with 51% of the vote, you're going to have to win with 56% of the vote. That means you're going to have to fight like a dog to resist these things and learn how to protect your vote. It's no longer as easy as just showing up and voting. In fact, in the back of my book, I have something called Steal Back Your Vote. In other words, it's just a thing you take out, and also at gregpalast.com. gregpalast.com, you can get Steal Back Your Vote, 7 Steps to Beat the Ballot Bandits. And what that is like basic protection. Like, go check out whether you're registered. And one way you defeat the system is keep re-registering. My daughter fought 3 months to get the right to vote in Georgia. She had including getting a Georgia driver's license, proving she was a citizen, etc. They don't want students to vote because, as far as they're concerned, they are just, you know, when you're in college, you're basically a Negro voter as far as they're concerned when you're in Georgia. They don't want you to vote. They know how you're going to vote. So they're going to apply all the ugly racial techniques to the student population. Look out. We have to work very hard to preserve our own votes.
I have a question. You mentioned about a loss of legitimacy, and you also talked about the Washington Post, what they said about you during the primaries. And we have another reader question. Dusty Myers wants to know how we get the national media to pick this story up. And they mentioned, no offense to Truthdig, but
What?
we're independent, so that's
Independent media. Thank God bless Truthdig and independent media. No kidding. If you think, you know, I'm not going to be on the NewsHour, whose official corporate sponsor is Chevron, which is going to do very well under the Trump regime. So you're not going to, you know, I am mainstream in the rest of the world. I report for BBC Television, the gold standard of English language news. I report for the Guardian newspapers, the top newspaper in this world in English. And now I'm in Rolling Stone here, which is, you know, which has a long history of digging out the truth now. But what we can't do is we have to now pressure those national outlets. You know, why are people still supporting the petroleum broadcast system? Send them back their mug if they don't give you the news. Say, keep the mug, we want the news. Okay?
Well, I actually saw some protesters outside of CNN, and they had standing rock signs saying, please cover this, please show more coverage. So I think people are a lot more mobilized right now. I have a question, though, about this evidence, this huge, massive evidence that you have that's suggesting that the GOP rigged the election.
Yes.
And you said you have a meeting in Washington. Does this mean that this can result in some sort of lawsuit? Can you?
There's already lawsuits.
So this unconstitutional.
So, for example, Reverend William Barber, who's head of the NAACP, he's really the new Martin Luther King. He's a brilliant, inspiring man. But more than that, he also understands the law. And he has filed a lawsuit in a court, federal court in North Carolina, to stop the electors of North Carolina from voting for Trump, because he said they used racist trickery to cut the Democratic vote, including citing my investigations of Crosscheck. Like I said, the Michigan ACLU is suing. They're nonpartisan, but they said, you know, this is 13,000 vote margin was stolen by Trump in Michigan. North Carolina stolen. And I will be going on December 13th to Congress. The Voting Rights Caucus, 79 members of Congress, will be gathering to review. Actually, they're going to watch my movie first, and then we're going to have the review of the evidence. I have stacks of evidence. I have said that I never can give out sources, but I can give out evidence, and I will be handing the Justice Department evidence. Alcee Hastings, the dean of the Congressional Black Caucus, took my film and book and my Rolling Stone articles and put them in the hands of Loretta Lynch, our Attorney General for the moment, for a few more weeks, and said, okay, you've got the evidence in your hand, so you can't say you didn't get it. We want some indictments. He says, I'm a former federal judge. I know a criminal conspiracy when I see it. This is it. So we have lawsuits, we have the Congressional Black Caucus, we have congressional hearings, we have state-by-state suits going. my phone's ringing off the hook because of all these civil rights organizations who are jumping in now saying we need that evidence, and I'm very glad. I mean, it's late because I was kind of doing the Paul Revere thing, like, hey guys, just look at the film. The election's about to be stolen, and and I actually thought, boy, I'm going to look like a real idiot when Hillary walks away with this.
What do you know?
But unfortunately, it was.
What
I
about,
don't like being right in this case.
what about in the movie, you confront some of the people that you've brought up here, and
Yes.
what has the response been, if any, since we last checked in about that? Because you go up to Chris Kobach.
Yeah,
and
well,
others.
Chris Kobach is the guy who created this system for Trump of wiping out
Secretary
voters.
of State of
He's
Kansas.
the Secretary of State of Kansas. He's also the guy who wrote that racist SB 1070 law.
Arizona.
It's called the Driving While Brown law by the ACLU. He's the guy who came up, by the way, he's the guy who came up with the idea of creating a wall and making Mexico pay for it.
And he's being implicated in stories I'm seeing about the Muslim registry.
Well, not just implicated.
Yeah.
He would, just so you know, Chris Kobach, and you'll see this in my film. I actually have this cartoon about him, another set of cartoons. In the cartoon, I show that he set up this Muslim tracking system for the Department of Homeland Security. Remember they used to have that eyeball total information awareness thing? I don't know if you remember that from after September 11th with George Bush.
I should, but I don't.
Everyone remember the TIA, total information awareness? They had this like the all-seeing eye on top of a pyramid. It was really creepy, and that included Chris Kobach with his Arab detector. And George Bush himself, he's not exactly Martin Luther King, but he actually said, Kobach, get rid of that thing. That's racist on its face. I don't want my name attached to it. So it was George W. who said that thing is racist, and now
Look how far we've
it's come back, and they're resurrecting the Muslim tracker. And that's Chris Kobach. And now, instead of being part of Homeland Security, unfortunately, we can pretty much count that he'll become the head of Homeland Security. I did confront him personally with the evidence he was rigging the election. I showed him the documentation. He couldn't believe it because this stuff was supposed to be confidential. So he's like, and I snuck in there. It's very funny. You'll see in the film. I walk in with one of those handheld microphones with a cube on it that said 4, like Channel 4 Eyewitness News. So he thought I was coming at him from a local TV station. In fact, I was working for Channel 4 of London, England, so it wasn't a lie. The cube was for real, but I had the cube made, but I really was working for a Channel 4. But then I confronted him and said, what about this? This is evidence that you are fixing this election. Here's the names. Why are you doing this? And then he just lies. He just spews lie after lie after lie. Some of the British papers actually contacted him, and the lies continue. Oh, we're not removing anyone. We're not doing this. We're not doing. And I have the actual written stone cold evidence. They can't get out of this one. They can't get out of it.
Can they follow the same? I asked you this last week, but I'm curious about, because we're getting a lot of pushback from readers and commenters who are saying, oh, he's just creating conspiracy theories. I know you're used to this kind of stuff, but can you tell, another time to this audience, can you say a little bit about how you justify your data? And, because not everyone's a statistician, so they can't all look at the same data set and know what it means. So we rely on you here to give us the interpretation.
Well, some of it you have. Look, I used to teach statistics, okay, and I have a degree from the University of Chicago, from Obama's old school, and I taught statistics and all that. But you don't have to be very sophisticated. If you look, this is I don't know if you can focus on this. This is a piece of the Crosscheck list, but I'll read you some of it. These are names that they said are the same. Okay, Michael Eugene Jackson Sr. is supposed to be the same as Michael LeBurn Jackson. Michael Leonard Jackson is supposed to be the same person, same voter as Michael Page Jackson. Michael Jerome Jackson is supposed to be the same as Michael Eugene Jackson, and so on and so on and so on. You don't need a PhD to know that.
Right, but when all those people removed.
And then they said, so they remove about 1 in 8, because what they do is they send out a postcard. If you don't return it, your name's removed. And by the way, that's another little trick. White suburban people return postcards from the government. Young voters, and especially voters of color, young voters, they're moving around. They don't even get these postcards, and so they lose their votes. It's another way to bend this system further. There is zero doubt, because they try to hide the list from me. Once I got the list, that's the stone cold evidence that they are removing these voters. And I showed the cards that they created. And also, by the way, it's not the only thing that they use. They use tricks like caging They use tricks like purging. They use tricks like the long lines. You'll love this one.
And closing down balloting. You know.
And so, like, for example, you have in Ohio, I was there on Souls to the Polls Day, Sunday before the normal voting day. 70% of African Americans in Ohio vote on Souls to the Polls Day. They go after church. Why? Because in 2004, they waited in the rain for 8 and 9 hours and didn't get to vote. That re-elected George Bush over Kerry in Ohio. So to avoid that, they say, okay, we'll do early voting. Yeah. So the violently Republican Secretary of State of Ohio said, the court said, you have to open the polls on Sunday. You must. So he said, okay, tell you what. Well, to be fair, every county will have one polling station on Sunday. One. That meant that little Podunk County with 6,000 residents had a polling station. It meant that the entire city of Cleveland had one polling station. The entire city of Cleveland. The entire city of Dayton. I was at the Dayton thing. Hours and hours waiting in line to get to the poll, which wound up and down a 3-story county building and out into the parking lot, spiraled around. Thank God that the Hillary people had a taco truck there.
And of course, if you look at the statistics of who generally lives in rural areas versus urban and how they vote.
But I have a question. How do you know it's the GOP? Because we see this kind of racism all over urban communities when it comes to food, access to health care, housing. I mean, how do we know it's not just racism or just a white supremacist agenda? And how do we know it's specifically the GOP?
Because, like, for example, in the case of Crosscheck, Chris Kobach is the official. This guy, Chris Kobach, is the official creator and controller of Crosscheck for the state. So it's official. They have a document that says he's the CEO. And you see, like, John Husted. And by the way, I don't think that these guys are actually necessarily racist. But they don't care about the color of people's skin. They care about the color of their vote, which is generally blue. I'm not a big defender of the Democratic Party by any means. But in this case, they're going after these voters because they vote blue, they vote Democratic. And so it's not kind of your daddy's redneck racism. It's a very sophisticated operation to say that these are vulnerable people, like, for example, in Florida in 2000, I'm the reporter who discovered, when I was working for BBC, who discovered that Katherine Harris, the Republican Secretary of State, and Jeb Bush, the governor at the time, had removed over 56,000 black men from the voter rolls, saying that they were felons, criminals, not allowed to vote. Well, it turns out I got my hands on the list. This is what American reporters don't do. They don't get the material. So I got the list, and lo and behold, start going through the list. I go, turns out that exactly zero, we showed this in the film, in a cartoon, exactly zero were illegal voters. Yeah. But they were all removed as felons. And it's very easy, this is where the racism comes in. It's very easy to say a young black man has a criminal conviction. So, like this guy, Willie Steen, who's in my film, he was a Gulf War veteran, he works at a hospital. You can't be a felon and work at a hospital in Florida. You can't even get the job. He went in with his 5-year-old son to show him, hey, here's how we vote in America. And he was told, you can't vote, you're a felon. He says, I never got a traffic ticket. Get out of here. The Democratic Party would not defend these black folk from the charge that they were criminals because they want, we can't defend felons. They're not felons. They're just young black men trying to cast a legal vote. So there's no defense from the Democratic Party. Very little, very rare. It doesn't happen. And I've seen this again and again. And a lot of it is because the Democrats will use these same tricks in their own primaries. So
they don't want to blow the lid off it. Yeah.
I'm curious, you're talking about resistance and marches and forms of protest, and I've seen a lot since the general election of people arguing that there should be faithless electors who vote the way they think the popular vote would. Do you have any thoughts on that as a form of protest?
Well, to quote my friend Jesse Jackson, the Reverend, said, the winner should win, and the loser should lose. And the person with the most votes is the winner in a democracy, and the person with the lesser votes is the loser. So the faith should be kept with the American people, and I would hope that electors will find it in their conscience and heart to vote the truth, including in those states where they know it was flipped by ugly Jim Crow tactics.
What about absentee ballots? You mentioned to me that you didn't think that Hillary Clinton should have conceded when she did, and that Gore shouldn't have conceded when he did because they weren't his votes and her votes to concede.
Yeah, I mean, Gore, I will give him credit for one thing. I mean, it was odd when Trump said elections are rigged. Hillary Clinton ran out and said, no American candidate has ever questioned the integrity of the American vote. I said, what? Excuse me. Al Gore went to the Supreme Court to challenge the vote.
Yeah, it's
but he did ultimately fold like a cheap suit. And Kerry, John Kerry later said, Greg Palast, this is a quote, Greg Palast is correct in his analysis of the 2004 election. Kerry does believe now that it was stolen from him in Ohio in 2004 through some of these less sophisticated but still effective tricks. So we do have a big problem. And one of the things that we don't ever talk about in America is the uncounted vote. So, for example, we have about probably, now this is a wild guess I'm telling you because I can't get these numbers yet, but from history it's about 5 million provisional ballots. Most will not be counted. My God, Hillary should say, I want and demand that those ballots be counted. 5 million ballots. Most of those will be her votes, by the way. Absentee ballots, especially from soldiers overseas. Soldiers, yes, are conservative by nature, but they don't like, they were very pro-Clinton. Okay, again, that military vote, the overseas vote, absentee ballots coming in late because in many states, like California, all you have to do is have your ballot postmarked. And so many of these ballots are not counted. Plus, we have what's called the invalidated ballots or spoiled ballots, about 2.5 million of those in a typical presidential election. We don't ever talk about the spoiled ballots. Ballots that just never get counted because they say, oh, there's a stray mark and the machine didn't read it. Oops, the machine didn't record it. Someone dropped coffee on the bubbles. Hanging Chad. Hanging Chad still exists.
Here they are again.
Still exists.
They've been hanging for 16 years.
Have you seen more efficient ways of voting in other countries?
Oh, yeah.
And which ones, like, could you
for example, in Switzerland, where if you don't vote, you get a fine. Everyone votes. They want you to vote. And they make it easy to vote, and you got to vote by law. Okay? So a Swiss voting company came to me with this ballot that cannot go wrong. It's colored, and it's real simple, and there's no way that can screw up. And he said, would you endorse this ballot? And I said, that won't help. In fact, it'll hurt. Because these guys don't want the machines to work. They have an advantage. So, for example, I was on the day before the election, on Monday, I was in a court in Columbus, Ohio, the capital of Ohio, and for Rolling Stone. I was in Democracy Now!, and I was allowed in chambers with the judge, where a great voting rights lawyer, Robert Fitrakis, had said, I have evidence, Your Honor, that the anti-hacking software has been turned off on these machines, and furthermore, the ballot imaging software. What this is, when you vote electronically sometimes, they now have new systems because people say, oh, there's no paper trail. They can take a picture of your vote on the screen. They take a picture in real time, several pictures, so they know, okay, there's your voting pattern, right? They turned off the imaging software so there's no record. It just tallies, but there's no record of an individual vote. And so that's hard to, you can't recount if there's no imaging. And they got a message from the FBI. Be aware of possible mass hacking of the vote. Their response to the mass hacking notification from the FBI was to turn off the anti-hacking software, the stuff that tells you if someone's tried to break in, tamper with the machine, added votes after closing hours, etc. So you can imagine. So I expected them to go in court and say, come on, Fitrakis, this is conspiracy nut stuff. Instead they said, yes, we did turn off the imaging software. Yes, we did turn off the anti-hacking. I kid you not, I can't make this up. They told the judge that they turned off the anti-hacking software. It's like, I almost fell out of my seat. This is the Attorney General, and the Republican Attorney General, and the Republican Secretary of State's lawyers. And they said, but to turn it back on, the anti-hacking software, the imaging software to make sure no one's messing around. I said, oh, that would create havoc. No, that would create democracy. But so we've got a system that is meant. They don't want a technical fix because even as we saw in Ohio, and the voting machine company said, okay, we will create a fix to these machines to reduce hacking, to create an image trail. So even when they have the equipment, they just turn it off. Because they don't want it to be a fair vote. They don't want it to be a fair vote because I'm going to put it bluntly, there aren't enough white guys in America to elect Donald Trump. So they got to get rid of the unwhite guys. And that's how this election happened. It wasn't a vote, it was an unvote.
Wow. I think we have a lot to think about after this conversation. Thank you so much for for the wealth of information and for all of your research that you've done. And we look forward to following up too on your meeting in Washington. And don't forget, he has this book and film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Go check it out. Thank you again for everyone that commented below. Continue the conversation and we'll try to get to you in the comments. Make sure if you enjoyed this conversation that you support Truthdig. We are independently run and we really rely on your support. So go to truthdig.com/support to give anything that you may or leave comments. Send us your feedback.
I endorse that. I really do. By the way, I want to thank Truthdig for giving me a place to bring my journalism home. I mean, I'm BBC and I'm in London, and my own words don't get back to my own home country except through wonderful outlets like Truthdig. Please support them. They didn't ask me to do this. This is a free commercial for a non-commercial outfit, and bless them for bringing my words back home and giving me this opportunity that I never get to have in America.
Oh, we're glad to have you. And
Thanks for joining
thank
us.
you again for everyone joining in. Kasha and Emma, thank you also. And if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, go to truthdig.com/subscribe and have a great holiday next week because we won't be here. Have a good one. Bye-bye.